Hi, John Hess from Filmmaker IQ. This last year I made two very crucial pieces for my understanding of how photography works: the science of exposure and metering, and diving into dynamic range. I really recommend you watch those in order as I lay out the material step by step to building an accurate understanding of how light makes its way into a camera and becomes an image. But I get it. Both videos with science and engineering that may have you scratching your head going, what does this have to do with filmmaking? And FYI, if you're around me and you ask that question, I will smack you and say everything can be made about filmmaking. Besides, YouTube's always telling us creators we have to come up with better titles and catchier thumbnails, more clickable and snackable video content, if you will. Well, maybe I'll do the clickbaity, optimized title. But whereas I hinted that the exposure triangle is hurting our understanding of image making in those lecture videos, in this video I'm going balls to the wall and expose just why the exposure triangle is a hindrance to the practical application of digital photography. Now, a little context before we get started here. Before I started making videos for this channel, Filmmaker IQ used to be a blog that aggregated filmmaking content from all around the web. Whenever somebody came up with a beginner's video explaining the exposure triangle, I would post it to the site and share it. And so would the other aggregator filmmaking and photography sites. Making those kinds of tutorial and instructional videos was and still is how you become known in the filmmaker blogosphere. And as a result, the exposure triangle cottage industry was born. Every wannabe filmmaker, photographer, instructor was making an exposure triangle video. It became sort of an arms race. I saw one video where the information was delivered so fast that only a person who was intimately familiar with the topic could understand it. Whether the video actually helped novices understand the material, that didn't matter, because they weren't the ones watching it. The readers who were reasonably well versed in the ideas, those were the guys that were watching and evaluating the videos. Because the truth of the matter is, if there's one thing that photographers and filmmakers like to do more than actually shooting photos and films, it's talking about shooting photos and films in online forums. And yes, that stings me right here. Ugh. Well, I'm about to drop a bomb on the cottage industry, metaphorically speaking. Please don't demonetize me, YouTube. So let's get to it. 6 reasons why we need to ditch the exposure triangle. Number 1, it's not a triangle. One day, this was still before we started making FIQ videos, I got the idea of trying to make my very own exposure triangle infographic. And you know what? When you get down to trying to design it, the triangle shape just makes no sense. And for anyone that has made it this far into the video and doesn't know, let's just define what the exposure triangle is. According to the exposure triangle, there are 3 elements of exposure: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, which we sometimes label as gain. These elements are arranged in a triangle shape like this, with each edge representing one of those exposure elements. But why is it a triangle shape at all? How does the triangle shape help us understand what's going on here? I mean, there are other famous triangle concepts out there where the visualization makes sense. Rock, paper, scissors shows the relationship between the 3 different choices you can make. The production triangle, money, time, and quality, is something we'll get into in another video. Perhaps it's supposed to emulate the color wheel, which is sort of like a triangle if we isolate the primary colors. This graphically illustrates what happens when we mix the colors, but where we can mix blue and green and no red and get cyan, we don't get any image if any of our exposure elements is 0. Maybe it's supposed to be like the famous voltage, current, resistance triangle, Ohm's law, from electronic engineering, which graphically illustrates the mathematical relationship. But that doesn't work for the exposure triangle because ISO does not equal aperture divided by shutter speed. It just doesn't work that way. The question remains, why a triangle shape? If we represent each side of the triangle as a gradient from dark to bright, this corner here represents where the shutter speed and aperture create a dark image, But then this corner over here, the ISO scale represents a darker image, but the shutter speed shows a brighter image. Or why not flip it around like this? Or even this so that no corner is matching. There's no rhyme or reason to any of it. My ultimate solution back in the day was to lay out the elements like a three-pointed star. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are all ways to increase brightness of an image, so the closer to the core of the star, the brighter the image. Then any combination of settings will result in a triangle. The idea was maybe you could describe any particular exposure by the shape of the triangle drawn on these three axes. But when I went to label the axes, I realized that whatever numbers I would put in there would be completely arbitrary. If the center of my three-axis graph was a really bright image, well, that could be ISO 6400 or it could be ISO 1,024,000. It could be f1.8 or f4.0. It could be 1/10 of a second shutter speed or 5 minutes. There is no origin. The placement of numbers is completely arbitrary. The only relationship this concept has with a triangle is its threeness. That brings us to another reason why we need to ditch the concept. Number 2, no, seriously, it's not a triangle. Not only is a triangle shape arbitrary, it's missing a couple key elements in order to make an image. First, we can't have an image unless we have incoming light, or the technical term, scene luminance. A major issue with the triangles that tends to force new photographers and filmmakers to think only about the settings on the camera, when real photography and cinematography needs to think in terms of the light in the scene as well. Now, this comes from lamps and flashes, which we can ultimately control either through the power or through our distance. And even if we're limited to using natural light from the sun, there are things we can do to adjust that light by changing our position, using reflectors, or waiting till a certain time of day. And yet there are going to be people that say there are certain situations where you simply can't control the light. Well, that's not a good case for the exposure triangle. And just because you can't control it doesn't mean the scene luminance doesn't matter. It just means that that scene luminance in that particular situation is locked. Just like you can lock your aperture, you can lock your shutter speed, you can lock your ISO. Just because a variable can be locked isn't a case for the exposure triangle. But before you think it's an exposure quadrilateral then, well, that doesn't make any sense either. I mean, it's not a circular relationship. The light coming from a scene doesn't change if we close the aperture. Heck, we can throw a lens cap on the lens and the light from the scene would be none the wiser. Our camera settings have a dependent relationship to scene luminance. But there's another important tool that the exposure triangle misses. Number 3, where are my ND filters at? ND filters may not be the go-to tool for a good chunk of photographers out there, and I say that knowing full well that there are many that do use them. The thing is, I'm sure a lot of photographers watch my videos on exposure, but this is ultimately a channel dedicated to the art of motion picture making. And with motion pictures, we often adhere to our 180-degree shutter rule to create normal looking motion blur. So our shutter speed is, for the most part, locked. Next, since I come from the days of small chip video cameras where everyone was jumping all over themselves trying to get a creamy, smooth, bokeh-licious background, we all want a shallow depth of field. Maybe not razor thin, but something tasteful to give our foreground some separation from the background. So our aperture is generally locked in a certain range. So what's left to control the actual brightness of an image? ISO and scene luminance, right? Well, there is one more tool, the ND filter. The ND filter is so important to cinematography that pretty much every modern camera designed primarily for motion picture capture has built-in ND filters, unless you get really, really high-end where they charge you extra for internal ND filters. That's like going to a steakhouse where they make you order the potatoes separately. With ND filters, we can dial in the look we want with the shutter and the aperture, and then raise and lower the ND filters to get the correct exposure. And just for completeness, there is a tool called the telecompressor for smaller sensor cameras. You might know it from the popular brand Metabone Speed Booster. While ND filters cut the amount of light coming in from our scene luminance, the speed booster concentrates light meant for a larger sensor onto a smaller one, effectively increasing the light that actually lands on the smaller sensor. So now that exposure triangle, if we want to be complete, has 5 parts: scene luminance, ND filters and speed boosters, then aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The exposure pentagram, I guess, if we're going to reach for another symbol of the occult. But now let's get a little more picky about our terminology. Number 4, ISO is not exposure. This one can take a little time to wrap your mind around. It took me a long time to accept it because our colloquial use of the word exposure means an image, a photograph. The exposure triangle has ISO as one of its legs, so naturally you would assume that ISO is a part of exposure. But let's be more precise about that word. So now, as most hackneyed essay writers do, let's turn to a dictionary for a definition. And believe it or not, dictionary.com offers some surprisingly detailed insight. Exposure as it pertains to photography. 1. The act of presenting a photosensitive surface to rays of light. 2. The total amount of light received by a photosensitive surface or an area of such a surface, expressed as the product of the degree of illumination and the period of illumination. 3. The image resulting from the effects of light rays on a photosensitive surface. Now that final definition fits our colloquial definition of exposure, meaning a photograph. But let's hone in on the first 2. The act of presenting a photosensitive surface to rays of light. Well, what is the act of presenting rays of light? The second definition further explains it. The total amount of light expressed as a product of the degree of illumination and the period of illumination. Degree of illumination, that sounds like the scene luminance regulated by ND filters and the aperture. And the period of illumination is the shutter speed. There's no mention of ISO in there at all, but that's a dictionary. Let's turn to another conventionally unreliable resource, Wikipedia. Search for exposure photography, and we get this long page. The very first section in definitions, we get this formula for luminous exposure. That's exposure based on the light that we can see, not all light energy, which is radiant exposure. The formula is HV equals EVT, illuminance of the surface measured in lux, and the exposure duration measured in seconds. Again, that sounds like scene luminance, ND filters, and aperture, with shutter speed defining the duration. There is no ISO. We have to go all the way down past all these other scientific formulas for describing exposure that have nothing to do with ISO, all the way down to the exposure control section of the Wikipedia article before we see any mention of the word ISO. The first 2 sentences read, "An appropriate exposure for a photograph is determined by the sensitivity of the medium used. For photographic film, sensitivity is referred to as film speed and is measured on a scale published by the International Organization for Standardization, ISO." Right there lies the distinction. The appropriate exposure is determined by the sensitivity of the medium, which is rated by ISO. So exposure is separate from the sensitivity rating. We control the exposure for our given ISO. ISO is not part of exposure. Now, why am I harping on extremely small nuance here? Well, this is fundamentally what's wrong with the exposure triangle. It doesn't represent this crucial dependency exposure has on ISO. Instead, it just arbitrarily lumps 3 elements together as equals when they are clearly not. And the reason why I got away with it was because with film, you couldn't change the ISO without changing the roll of film. So ISO was essentially one of those elements that was locked. But now with digital, you can, in a way, but the rules of digital make it a little more complicated. Now, I'm not going to rehash all the technical details I did in my exposure and dynamic range videos, but I thought of a better analogy I wanted to share right now on how to approach what ISO really is. So imagine we have a blank wall. This represents the entire range of our sensor, from the brightest at the top to the darkest at the bottom. It has a finite height, say of 20 meters, which represents the maximum light it can register. Then at the bottom of the wall, which represents our darkest shadows, we have a bunch of weeds and grass. This represents noise. Now let's say 50 meters from this wall, we have Jeremy Renner as Hawkeye from the Avengers. We could use Katniss, but J-Law isn't as popular right now, and I figure we need to give Hawkeye something to do before his show comes online, because those movies didn't give him a whole lot to do. When Hawkeye fires his arrow at the wall, that represents exposure, all of it, from scene luminance, ND filters, aperture, and shutter speed. Where the arrow lands, let's say, is the middle gray of our scene. The higher the arrow goes, the more exposure, the more light that lands on the sensor. The lower the arrow goes, the less exposure, the less light that lands on our sensor. Now, if Hawkeye fires his arrow too high, the arrow misses the wall. That's overexposed. If he fires the arrow too low, it gets lost in the weeds, and that's underexposed. Ultimately, we want Hawkeye to hit the wall. The question is where? Where on the wall do we want to paint our target for Hawkeye to aim at? The target represents the middle gray of our final photograph, or final image. Now, if Hawkeye's feeling kind of weak, we might set our target down near at the bottom of the wall, near all those weeds. That's a high ISO. If Hawkeye's feeling really strong and up to shooting an arrow high, maybe we set our target up higher. That's a lower ISO. Now, before finishing this analogy, let's get to my next point. Number 5, ISO does not create noise. In every exposure triangle diagram, you see the effects of shutter speed, which is motion blur, the effects of aperture, which is depth of field, and the effects of ISO, which is increased noise. But ISO doesn't create noise. It merely amplifies what noise is already there. Let's go back and finish my Hawkeye analogy. Let's say Hawkeye spent all night partying at the defeat of Thanos. Oops, spoiler alert. So today he's tired and he can only get the arrow so it lands down here at the bottom part of this wall. If our target's down there, here a really high ISO, there's a lot of weeds down there creating a lot of noise. The resulting image will be very noisy because our exposure arrow, which is on target, is so close to that noise. So now let's mix our character analogies together and give Hawkeye some spinach, and he gets his energy back up. Now we can set the target higher, a lower ISO rating, and Hawkeye's exposure arrow lands up here. The weeds and the grass at the bottom of the wall don't disappear, they're still there. It's just that our target is now farther away from the weeds. Our signal to noise ratio is stronger, therefore less perceivable noise. The relationship between higher ISO and noise is not causation, but correlation. Again, I know this sounds like a nitpick, but it's important. Why? Because the solution to reducing noise is not about reducing ISO, it's about increasing exposure. Noise is always present. We need more signal. Back to the arrow analogy. If we have this weak exposure arrow which lands down here among the weeds, simply lowering the ISO by just raising the target, not the arrow, will result in underexposing the image, but the arrow is still down there among the weeds. This is because ISO, as we said before, is not part of exposure. We must instead add more exposure, give Hawkeye some spinach so he can shoot the arrow higher on the wall. Now, this concept comes into play with the technique exposing to the right, or ETTR. With ETTR, you paint your target on the wall, then purposely have Hawkeye add a little muscle so he hits a little higher than the target. Now when we get to post-production, we erase our original target and redraw it where the arrow landed. Now on the downside, this gives us less headroom because the wall is only so high, but on the positive side, we get more distance between the arrow and those noisy weeds down there in the bottom. Redrawing the target after the arrow has landed seems like a cheat in archery, but it's becoming more and more common in photography and filmmaking because number 6, ISO is no longer set in stone. Go ahead and try to change your aperture settings or shutter speed in post. Without using fancy data manipulation tools, you simply can't. Once the picture is taken, the light from the scene through ND filters, aperture, and shutter speed, that's locked. In other words, the exposure side is set. But the ISO, that you can still change. Back to the Hawkeye analogy. I'm going to wring that analogy dry. When you're shooting RAW, you are essentially taking that entire wall and storing it into a file. Now the wall is blank to begin with, so we might paint an initial target right here in the middle of the wall. That is basically what base ISO is. It's only a middle of the road suggestion. Maybe we set the target higher and pick a lower ISO. That means we need more exposure to get that middle gray arrow to land up here. But then say Hawkeye is off his game and an arrow instead lands down here. And you know what? Mistakes happen. Hawkeye isn't perfect, and you know what? Iron Man was too darn expensive. That's okay, because we're saving the entire wall to our file. We can simply move the target after the arrow has already landed. Look at that, a bullseye. Sure, the signal to noise ratio is lower, but it would be exactly the same if we put our target down here in the first place. This is the concept behind the ISO-less or ISO-invariant cameras you see being talked about. It's not magic, it's just made possible because we save the entire wall, the entire dynamic range of the sensor itself, and because unlike real elements of exposure, ISO is not locked in stone. The caveat to this is not all cameras save the entire wall in our analogy in the same way. And some cameras even send out gardeners to trim the weeds if you decide you want to place your target low with a high ISO. That's called noise reduction. Then there are things like dual ISO, where there are different shots, different sized walls, depending on where your target is. And I got into that on my video on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. Now, since this video is already getting a little wordy, I'll let you figure out how this Hawkeye analogy explains why you should shoot dark scenes with lots of shadows with as low an ISO as possible, and really, really bright scenes with a lot of key information in the highlights with a higher ISO. Not crazy, but higher ISO. Leave your solution in the comments below. Let's recap. Boiling it down, the 6 reasons why we should ditch the exposure triangle. Number 1, it's not a triangle. The triangle shape lends no insight into the relationship between the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Number 2, there's more than 3 elements involved with obtaining exposure. First and foremost is the scene luminance, which you can change, and is often the first thing that we should change. Number 3, the triangle ignores the role of ND filters, which are crucial to exposure control, especially in motion picture. Number 4, the triangle places ISO as an element of exposure when by definition it is not part of the exposure and therefore not an equal player to aperture and shutter speed. Number 5, the triangle leads people to think the relationship between ISO and noise is causal when it is a corollary effect. Reducing noise requires more exposure, not just by reducing ISO by itself. And number 6, the triangle makes no distinction between exposure elements which are locked once the image is taken and the ISO, which is becoming more and more malleable in post-production. Thing is though, I don't believe the exposure triangle is going anywhere. There are a lot of people who will continue to use it as a teaching tool for beginners. And for those beginners, myself included at one point, it might be the thing that gets them to understand the terminology of the camera system. And for a lot of folks, that might just be all they ever want to know. Ignorance is in some ways bliss. But when you want to get deeper, the exposure triangle literally stands in the way of understanding. I took a better part of a year to write my lectures on exposure and dynamic range, mainly because of the mental blocks in my mind created by the exposure triangle. And it was really all centered around the inclusion of ISO. My initial confusion with ISO required me to take a long journey around. It was only by taking the whole process apart bit by bit and then rebuilding it that I better understand these relationships in order to present them to you in my videos. Now, my replacement proposal from the triangle is the pathway of light. Grandiose, I know. Think of it as the path light has to travel. how it bounces off a scene, that's scene luminance. It enters the cameras, the ND filters it has to go through, the aperture, the shutter speed, onto a photographic sensor where the light is turned into an electronic signal where the gain is applied to get it to conform to an ISO rating. It's not a triangle, it's a path with a very clear direction. And to me at least, it's easier to remember that than the brute force memorization of an arbitrary triangle. So I implore you, bloggers, photo film educators, filmmakers making educational content, random people on filmmaking Facebook boards that have no business talking about filmmaking, let's ditch the exposure triangle. But if you insist on using it, fine. But can we please stop being so dogmatic about the triangle itself? It's a learning aid, but does not describe what's happening in a camera. Every single drawn-out discussion on the exposure triangle, every comment I've had to engage on YouTube saying I'm wrong about ISO, stems from one of the failures I listed above. Ignorance is bliss, but arguing against ignorance is just plain annoying. Well, at least now I have a 4,000-word video that I can link in those discussions. Hopefully you got something useful out of my diatribe. If that's the case, hit the thumbs up and subscribe. Consider becoming a patron on Patreon so I can spend more time making explorations into filmmaking, the craft, the science, and history. If you didn't like this video, drop down to the shelf below and order yourself an official Filmmaker IQ t-shirt. Check out our latest design, Calling the Roll. Now you know what to do before you call action. Buy one or two, get a crate if this video really pissed you off. I mean, I'm devastated. I stay awake at night dreading that some hater might one day buy me out of stock on these wonderful t-shirts. Of course, if you like this video, pick one up for yourself as well. All right, folks, that's all I have today. Go out there and expose something great. I'm John Hess. I'll see you at Filmmaker IQ.